Hello everyone, welcome back. Again, this is Ladu Elias, and in today's tutorial I'll be taking you through the next source of information, and that is the secondary source of information. In my previous video I've gone through the first source of information, and that is the primary source of information. So in today's tutorial we shall be looking at basically the secondary source of information and how useful and valuable it is in the roles of research. So by the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to know and use effectively, or you'll be able to analyze what a secondary source of information is. Therefore, briefly, let us look at the outline for this tutorial. We shall be looking at the definition of this secondary source of information. So I'll be looking at as well the characteristics of the secondary source of information, the examples of this so-called secondary source of information. So I'll be looking at as well the purpose that the secondary source of information has to play, or the purpose of which it has to play to do with, and we shall be looking at its role that it plays in research, what basically this source of information plays in research, and we shall be looking at the time frame when is that source of this secondary source of information being gotten is our next item in the list, and we shall also be looking at this reliability of this source of information, how reliable it is. And as being an information literacy student, how reliable is this source of information useful to you, either to your research and whatsoever. And we shall also be looking at the pros and the cons. The pros and the cons here are the advantages and the disadvantage of this source of information. So we shall also be looking at the advantage and the disadvantage of this secondary source of information, and therefore we shall be able to conclude and analyze how useful and good the secondary source of information is. So briefly, let us go through the first item in the list in our outline, and that is what is a secondary source of information. Therefore, briefly, a secondary source of information, it is one that interprets, it as well analyzes or summarizes the primary sources of information. Therefore, it is not like a primary source which is being picked or being recorded at an event, but therefore it interprets, analyzes, and it summarizes the information which is from the primary source, and therefore it is one step removed from its original source. If I say one step removed from its original source, is that the original source we mean is the primary source of information. So it's one step removed in such a way that some of the things are altered. It is mediated, and therefore it doesn't it's not directly recorded in as that of the primary source of information, and therefore it offers a broader perspective of how we analyze that primary source of information, and also provides a critical insight of the primary source of information. Therefore, that is how a secondary source of information is. Therefore, you get to know and mark the differences in the definition of the primary source and the secondary source of information. Now, we shall be looking now at the characteristics of this secondary source of information. We as well know the secondary source of information by it being interpretative in such a way that this secondary source of information involves some levels of analysis. You need to analyze the primary source of information. You need to analyze the source of information. You need to synthesize the source of information. You need to evaluate this primary source of information, that you can be able to have critical understanding, and you can be able to critique the primary source of information or the event of this phenomenon. Okay, let us look at its evaluative nature. It is evaluative in such a way that they offer opinions or assessments based on evidence that may be drawn from primary sources. Like they evaluate the primary source of information, which is the original source of information. So this secondary source of information, they evaluate the primary source of information in order to come about with the secondary source of information, and it also contextualize the secondary sources of information in such a way that it summarizes this primary source of information. It helps to frame or contextualize this primary information with broader trends and movement and histories. Having learned about that, let us move to the examples of these secondary sources of information and what are they really, these secondary sources of information. Therefore, these secondary sources of information, they can be books in such a way they can be historical books analyzed at a specific historical period or event. They can be biographies that interpret an individual's life and on like any reason like based on a primary material. They can be journals or articles in such a way that articles that require that critique or analyzes primary data, they are termed as secondary sources of information, such as research papers. They analyze the results of a scientific experience, the literature reviews. When you're doing the research, they summarize previous research on a topic, and therefore it will take us to documentaries. This is also another example of a secondary source of information. It can be films, videos that tell the story of that tell historical events, things that happens long ago, where we even don't know, like about an individual or event. So this is an example of a secondary source of information, and we have the encyclopedias. Encyclopedias is this like summarizes well-established knowledge or events based on a secondary research, and therefore we look at the essays and reviews is also an example of a secondary source of information in such a way that critical essays that provides analysis of a literacy or work or historical event often building upon primary text. Therefore, it can be movie or books reviews and interpret the context of a certain work done by a certain person. Therefore, this will take us to the next item in our outline, and that is the purpose this secondary source of information plays. Therefore, its purpose is that it's like contextualization, like they provide the necessary context for primary sources. That is why I say contextualization. They synthesize information to offer a wider and broader understanding of a secondary source of information or a particular data. We can also one of its purpose can be interpretation and analysis in such a way that it analyzes and interprets these primary sources of information in order to summarize them, come with a brief and precise information, and that information that I come with is the secondary source of information. It offers a broader understanding in such a way that it helps treat specific events or pieces of data within large society, can be culture, can be historical frameworks, providing a fuller picture of a certain event. Therefore, let us briefly look at the roles this secondary source of information plays in research in such a way that they are used to support or critique the use of primary sources. Like for scholars, interpret data, they interpret primary data in such a way that by providing existing frameworks, theories, which are termed as primary source of information. Now, these secondary sources also often offers guidance or guide researchers in framing their own questions or instituting their findings within large debates or contexts. And this will take us to the time frame of this primary source of information. In my previous video, I talked about the primary source of information and the time frame in that it is being picked or recorded at the time the event is taking place. But for this secondary source of information, it is typically written after the event. After the event has passed, can be several decades, can be several years, can be several days, can be several hours, and that is when the primary source of information will be written. It is written after an event, and therefore it also after reflection of an analysis, critical analysis of a primary source of information, that is when the secondary source of information will be created. And therefore, let us look at its reliability in such a way that we're going to look at the strength and the challenges of this secondary source of information. So one of the strengths of this secondary source of information is that it offers interpretation and clarity, and it offers interpretation and clarifies the meaning of primary sources of information. And let us briefly look at the challenges of this secondary source of information. Is that it is one step removed from the original event. Therefore, it can also be deceiving, it can be dissatisfying, it can provide incomplete information because it is being recorded by someone who is not a witness, and it is being passed from one person to another and to another person. Therefore, it is one step removed from the original data. This will take us to pros and the cons. As I said before, pros means the advantages of this secondary source of information, and the cons means the disadvantage. So looking at this secondary source of information, we say it provides critical analysis and comprehensive reviews. Critical analysis and comprehensive reviews of the primary source of information. It helps connect different pieces of information. Like they can connect dots of information from one source, can be from another source, and they can combine together to form a well-established research work, or well-established information, and it's easier to access and understand that than the raw primary data, which requires some critical and contextual knowledge to analyze, to come up with the final conclusion. So in this secondary source of information, it's being summarized, being analyzed, and therefore it is very easier to access and understand. So we shall be looking at now the cons, which are the disadvantages of these sources. It is that can introduce misinterpretations or biasness. It can be misinterpreting and misleading in such a way that the person who will be giving that information, like from the primary source, will give a wrong information, a biased information, and therefore it will not serve the fullness of the secondary source of information. It can be it is a second hand, in fact, a second hand event. As being a second hand event, so they lack the the immediacy and authenticity of the primary sources of information. Basically, that is what you need to know about the secondary source of information, and you get to know that the secondary source of information, it interprets and analyzes the primary sources. Mainly the secondary source of information, it interprets and analyzes the primary source of information. It has a broader context, it critiques information. That is how useful and good it is. It is very robust. It relies on getting data from all corners everywhere, and therefore forms a satisfying source of information. And therefore, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, you can subscribe to Larry Elias, and you click on the notification bell so that you will be able to get such videos like this, and to help you to become a good and information literate individual, and be able to use the skills in these tutorials in the form of in your research work, and you'll be able to become a good researcher and a good scholar. Thank you. See you in my next video.